Welcome back to In History. Today's video we'll explore the wealthiest individuals to have ever lived. What's fascinating about these figures is not just their staggering wealth, but how they acquired it. As you'll see, true wealth often comes from power, war, politics, and ruling nations, rather than simply trading goods and services like many of today's billionaires. We'll count down the top 10 from the poorest to the richest, diving into their life stories, how they rose to such great wealth, and the time periods they lived in. We begin our list with William the Conqueror, who lived from 1028 to 1087. William is most famous for his conquest of England in 1066, a feat that drastically changed European history. Born the illegitimate son of the Duke of Normandy, William rose through the ranks of nobility, eventually becoming the Duke of Normandy himself. His true wealth came from his victory at the Battle of Hastings, after which he became the first Norman king of England. Upon taking the English throne, William seized vast amounts of land and wealth from the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, making him incredibly wealthy. The famous Domesday Book, a survey of his kingdom, reveals the extent of his wealth and power. Unlike today's billionaires who earn their fortunes through business, William's wealth was built through war, conquest, and control over land. Next we have Mir Osman Ali Khan, who was the last Nizam or ruler of the princely state of Hyderabad in India. He ruled from 1911 to 1948 during the final years of British colonial rule in India. His wealth, like many on this list, was not earned through business ventures, but rather inherited and amassed through his control over Hyderabad's rich resources, including diamonds, gold, and extensive land holdings. At the height of his wealth, he was considered the richest man in the world. One of his most famous possessions was the Jacob diamond, a jewel the size of an egg. Though his fortune was immense, Mir Osman Ali Khan is remembered as a frugal ruler who rarely spent money on himself, even as he sat atop a treasure trove of wealth. His fortune highlights how, historically, political control and land ownership have often been the keys to vast wealth. Moving on, we have John D. Rockefeller, one of the first American tycoons to make this list. Born in 1839, Rockefeller became the wealthiest man in modern history through his control of the oil industry. He founded Standard Oil in 1870, which at its peak controlled about 90% of the oil production and distribution in the United States. Unlike many on this list, Rockefeller's wealth came from industry rather than conquest or land. However, his business was so powerful that it effectively controlled an essential resource: oil. His company was later broken up by the US government for violating antitrust laws, but by that time, Rockefeller's personal fortune was so vast that it would be worth around $340 billion today. Rockefeller's legacy shows us that while the merchant class can rise to extraordinary wealth, the scale of power and control he had over a resource made him more than just a businessman. He was an empire builder in his own right. Next on our list is Andrew Carnegie, who, like Rockefeller, was an American industrialist. Born in 1835 in Scotland, Carnegie immigrated to the United States and built his wealth through the steel industry. By the late 1800s, Carnegie Steel was the largest steel producer in the world, and in 1901 he sold the company to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, which would be worth over $372 billion today. Carnegie's story is often framed as a rags-to-riches tale, and unlike many on this list, his wealth came not from inheritance or conquest, but from his relentless drive in business. However, much like Rockefeller, Carnegie's wealth was not simply from buying and selling goods. It came from dominating an industry that was essential to national infrastructure, making him one of the most powerful men in the world. Moving into the ancient world, we come to Mansa Musa, who ruled the Mali Empire from 1312 to 1337. Musa's wealth was largely derived from the gold and salt trade, as Mali was one of the richest producers of gold in the world during his reign. His fortune is often estimated to have been around $400 billion, making him one of the richest men in history. Mansa Musa is famous for his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, during which he distributed so much gold that he caused inflation in the cities he passed through. His wealth was tied directly to his control over the empire's resources, and like many rulers of the past, his fortune was less about personal achievement and more about the resources and power of the land he governed. Next is Jakob Fugger, a German merchant and banker who lived from 1459 to 1525. Fugger was incredibly wealthy by controlling mining operations and financing European monarchs, making him one of the wealthiest people in history. Unlike others on this list who gained wealth through land ownership or ruling empires, Fugger's fortune came from the financial world. Fugger essentially invented modern banking practices and lent money to some of Europe's most powerful rulers, including the Habsburg dynasty. His wealth is an example of how the merchant class could accumulate vast fortunes. But what truly set him apart was his influence over political leaders, making him one of the most powerful men of his era. While Joseph Stalin's wealth wasn't personal in the traditional sense, he controlled the entire economy of the Soviet Union during his time as its leader from the 1920s until his death in 1953. At its height, the Soviet Union's GDP was estimated at around $7.5 trillion. Stalin's control over one of the largest and most powerful nations in the world gave him vast power and influence, effectively making him one of the wealthiest individuals to have ever lived. His wealth was not earned, but taken through political control and brutal authoritarian rule. Next, we have Augustus Caesar, who lived from 63 BCE to 14 CE. Augustus was the first emperor of Rome and ruled over an empire that spanned much of the Mediterranean world. At the height of his power, his personal fortune was estimated to be worth $4.6 trillion, thanks to his control over Rome's vast wealth and resources. Augustus's wealth was a combination of conquest, taxation, and control over one of the most powerful empires in history. His rule marked the beginning of the Roman Empire, and his wealth was tied directly to the success and expansion of the empire he led. In second place is Akbar the Great, who ruled the Mughal Empire from 1556 to 1605. His empire controlled much of India, and his wealth was built on the extensive agriculture, trade, and efficient taxation of his vast lands. His fortune is estimated at 21 trillion. Akbar's wealth, like many on this list, was tied to his political power. The Mughal Empire was one of the most powerful in the world at the time, and Akbar's policies of religious tolerance and efficient governance helped him amass an incredible fortune. Finally, we have Emperor Shenzong of Song, who ruled China from 1067 to 1085. The Song dynasty was one of the wealthiest and most advanced civilizations of its time, and Shenzong's wealth is estimated to have been around $30 trillion. His wealth came from the total economic output of China, which was the world leader in agriculture, trade, and technology at the time. Shenzong's fortune shows how the wealth of a nation, when controlled by a single ruler, can reach astronomical heights. His wealth was built on the vast resources and economic power of one of the most prosperous empires in history. And there you have it, the 10 wealthiest people to ever have lived. As we've seen, true wealth, particularly in history, was often tied to power, politics, and war. While today's billionaires may control vast fortunes, the wealth of emperors and rulers who controlled entire nations was on an entirely different scale. Thank you for joining me on this journey into history's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below on what ancient mystery you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge. See you next time on In History.